Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about the intersections between the feminine and altered states of consciousness. I'm going to be using this word quite a bit. It's femtheogens, femtheogenic consciousness. I'm going to start by just opening it up a bit so we're on the same page. So the word femtheogen it's a compound word. It's made up of two words, feminine and entheogen. Entheogen or anthrogenic is another word for psychedelic. Psychedelic stands for, well, people say mind manifesting, psyche manifesting really is the right etymology. Entheogenic is about the sacred and sort of divine quality of a psychedelic experience. So for shortness, as Peter said earlier, I'm going to be using the word femtheogenic quite a lot. So it's the fusion between the feminine essence and the altered stage of consciousness. So I started working on this in 2013. I was trying to get a paper ready for Boom Festival 2014. The theme that year was the Year of the Feminine. And it's been a long journey. I didn't expect how long or how intense at times or how rich it was going to be. My encounters with the world of the feminine in these 6-7 years really have taken me to recognize and get in touch with my fertile energies within, and I'm not talking about childbearing and childbirth, I'm talking about the creative fertile energies we all have within us, and it has helped me build bridges between the world on the inside and the world on the outside. So she has helped me integrate a lot of my sense of self and a lot of the work that I'm producing at the moment. And she hasn't helped me with PowerPoint very much. But we're going to get there. So my work was first published by Psychedelic Press, December 2014, which was the first collection of essays that I show my work and my name written on, and it was very exciting, and loads of good friendships and collaborations have come out of that. And then a couple of years later, Psychedelic Press published, under the banner of Maswell Hill Press, which is Tim Reed, published a book, Out of the Shadows, which was a collection of essays from Psychedelic Press that were coming together. And then the latest stop has been a book I co-edited with Chiara Baldini and David Luke, and it was published April 2019. It's a very, very new thing. This book is a collection of essays. Sorry, something is coming up that doesn't make sense here. So this book is a collection of essays that explores the intersection between feminine consciousness and altered states of consciousness. And it's a collection of essays that has emerged out of a deep sense that what we're witnessing in the collective whole at the moment is really a need and a call to remember feminine essence back into our consciousness, back into our collective consciousness. So we're living through times where huge collective splits are becoming amplified in the wider world stage. And we come to see quite clearly how the wound of separateness has become infected, and it's pouring out of every societal pore. It seems that unless things get infected, there is very little hope of action in our society. Separateness is systemic. It starts with the other out there, and it seeps into our most intimate connections, and it seeps into our relationship and connection with our own self. Likewise, oppression that arises out of the idea and the altar of separateness is also systemic. It is the feminine, it is the colonized nature, it is the refugees, it is the homeless and displaced that are the weakest links in our society. In systemic thought, we say that a system is as strong and as resilient as its weakest link. The weakest links are not negligible. The weakest links is where care and attention needs to be directed at the most. It's also where change, growth, and vitality will eventually emerge from. If we think about the proportion of those that are well off in today's world, with the proportion of women that have managed to lead safe lives in today's world, to the proportion of nature that is still vital and vibrant in today's world, we will find that they are really related to each other. I don't think we can address or recover either of them unless we really focus on all of them together. We're at a time where we need a wide enough systemic lens if we are to really address what is infected in our society today. And most importantly, we need to somehow release and recover the capacity for compassion, because I think that's the only way we can bridge all the otherness our world has fallen into today. The book we brought out in April aims to address the inequalities within psychedelic culture by bringing more feminine voices and feminine matters to the surface. We wanted to bring the feminine in her many forms and her many guises into clearer view, for the psychedelic community to be fed, to be touched, to be inspired, and to be mobilized by. Now, this book does not address all the inequalities we foster in our community, and I'm talking about the psychedelic community. It points to some, and of course there are always more to look at. I think that the wider psychedelic community, being resourced by the vision of the feminine and the vision of altered states, can really meet our current challenges from the forefront of inclusivity, and it can match visionary poetics with decisive action and activism. The book, The Restoration of the Feminine, the Psychedelic Experience, are all deeply political matters, because they call on us to take our place in the responsibility and the consequence of it all. We're not talking here, when we talk about the feminine, about the absence of the feminine, because the feminine or the masculine are elemental, archetypal energies of the world. They can never be absent. We're talking about the distortion of the feminine that has exaggerated the tragic imbalance between the masculine and the feminine energies of our world. This tragic imbalance is really undermining our civilization, and it's bringing us nearer possible collapse, and it's taken us to a very destructive place. Through our disconnected intellect in the world we live today, we have raped the earth we live on, we have disrupted the intricate balance of our planet, we have created phallic missiles of mass destruction, and we have disguised the impotence of patriarchy as power that expresses itself in genocidal behavior. In order for humanity to move forward at this point, it is really essential that we call and integrate whatever human capacity has remained underdeveloped and delegated to our collective unconscious, to our collective shadow. Instead of consistently over-relying on an overdeveloped one-sidedness, we really need to look for the feminine qualities that are dormant potential in all of us, that is men and women. And I think here we will find medicines that are long lost and forgotten, and these are medicines that we have all longed for, whichever side of the splits or the divides that have been created we may find ourselves in. The developmental goal in Jungian analytical psychology is called individuation. This is the journey towards unfolding a deeper and a fuller sense of self. This is about being able to live into our fuller potential. We can never fully individuate. It is always a journey, but we can get a little bit nearer. But we cannot individuate unless we integrate our shadow material. Psychedelic and altered states allow a unique access into the personal and collective shadow, and they can really unearth what has been hidden, lost, or sometimes exiled. And they take us to the shadow part of the unconscious that can hold peril alongside potential. Here we find the darkness that connects, that complements our light, or the light that complements our darkness. In the realms of feminine and anthrogenic consciousness, we can retrieve the medicines of interconnectedness, fertility, regeneration, compassion, embodied wisdom, feelings, kinship, and belonging. If all these forces were to return to our world today, a deep restructuring would take place. If we fail to recover the wisdom of our interconnectedness that the feminine essence and anthrogenic spaces carry forward and express, then our current sociopolitical and spiritual wasteland will only worsen. On an individual level, we have neglected our hearts and we have deprived ourselves from the sanctuary of community and relationships, which are really nourishing spaces. It's really not surprising that in our internal and external state of alienation, we give in more and more to diseases of the mind, diseases of the spirit, and diseases of the body. But of course, anthrogenic consciousness teaches us that nothing exists in isolation. Our individual psyches reflect on the societies we build on, and our personal crisis and individual crisis translate to horrifying social crisis. In our target and money-driven societies, we have forgotten how to care for each other, and we have forgotten how to care for ourselves. There are issues like overpopulation, hunger, water shortages, sanitation, and the spread of infectious diseases in many parts of the world, and we're not really addressing them effectively. Our individual and social crises extend to the environment and the ecology around us. We have ravaged the rainforests, we have overfished and depleted our seas, we have contaminated our rivers, we have excavated our mountains, and our ever-increasing demands for food and technology are really depleting Earth's vital resources. Our exploitation of Earth and its resources is amounting to ecocide, as we're disrupting ecosystems that species really depend on. And then our ecocidal tendencies are linked with our genocidal tendencies, as we're waging wars on the basis of diminishing resources and on the basis of precious resources. The only light in this darkness is understanding that the moment of crisis is a potential, always potential, moment of deep transformation. We have to face our darkness before the old solidified ego boundaries can be shattered, and through the cracks of that process, the possibility of something new may emerge. Humanity has fallen captive to a great forgetting. We seem to go through cycles of collective events that we fail to assimilate or integrate, and we find ourselves compelled to compulsively repeat the trauma we have already gone through a million times. And we have come up against resistance from the ossified status quo with regards to the inevitable changes we're being called to navigate at the moment. As we stand before the thresholds of sociopolitical and environmental breakdown, we're going to need all the resources we can muster. We're going to need to transcend our structural and self-imposed limitations of otherness, separateness, and isolation. In trying to reveal some of the feminine quality today, I will be focusing on the archetypal feminine rather than the personal feminine, because she has a much stronger force and charge. So the personal feminine would be your own mother, your own grandmother, your sister, your friends, but the archetypal feminine is the great mother or the great goddess or Virgin Mary. There's this bigger-than-life entities. Archetypes are human inheritance, our collective human inheritance. They are psychic entities that have existed since the beginning of time, and they have developed through mythological, symbolic, and religious motifs that have informed humanity, what it is like to be human. The archetypes exist in the collective layers of the unconscious, in our collective unconscious, and their main aim is to mediate between unconscious and conscious self. So they express themselves primarily through symbols or metaphors, and they're trying to bring information up into consciousness that we can make use and metabolize. So the feminine archetype is not a singular entity. She manifests in a multitude of forms and aspects. And like all archetypes, she ranges from dark to light. She ranges from the positive end to the negative end. And the archetypal feminine is not just related to women. The archetypal feminine is relevant to all of us because it's an elemental pattern we all hold within our psychic depths, whether we're men or women. It's something that relates and informs all of us. As the archetypal masculine. So as an archetype, the feminine is always and ever present. She pushes through the layers of our collective unconscious, and she speaks to us in many voices. She speaks to us individually, and she speaks to us collectively. But while she's never absent, she very often goes by unnoticed, because we have forgotten in our culture who the feminine is. And we have reduced her great depth into a very flat version of womanhood. I'm going to be using, as a first diagrammatic map, the work of Jungian analyst Gareth Hill, and we're going to use it as a very diagrammatic sketch that I want you to keep in mind as we're moving through the various layers and qualities of the archetypal feminine and psychedelic states. So Gareth Hill is a Jungian analyst that divided the archetypal feminine in two aspects, the static and the dynamic aspect. And by doing so, he has managed to really map out the most essential qualities of the feminine and has managed to reach the great depth that she operates in. The static feminine is connected to motherhood and nourishment. She is gestating deep primal secrets of creation within her body. She's able to conceive the potential of life and give birth to it. And by doing so, the feminine participates in one of the greatest mysteries of life on earth. That great mystery is the capacity to manifest the soul into material life. In this process, the feminine participates in the rhythms and the process of creation and regeneration. It is that link to regeneration that makes the feminine really essential for our collective healing processes. Woman magic and earth magic is linked. They both create and they both nourish life. They both serve the impersonal goals of life on earth: species preservation and survival. For our early ancestors, this link between the feminine and nature was at first a great point of worship, until man gradually tried to control, manipulate, and suppress both, and he created a very deep imbalance in our relationship with both. The dynamic feminine is quite hard to pin into words, and it's quite slightly more relevant to the psychedelic experience. The dynamic feminine is represented by a surrendering watery flow towards what's new, what's non-rational, and what's playful. She's spontaneous, she's responsive, she's intuitive, and she forms according to what life brings her way. So there's a very deep surrendering in her essence. She receives wisdom by engaging with direct experience, and she reaches through to knowledge that exists in the very deep inner worlds. The dynamic feminine is connected to the creative and regenerative aspects of chaos, and she's supporting the creative synthesis that new possibilities emerge out of. She's part of that slowly emerging evolutionary drive. The dynamic feminine represents spaces that can be really ecstatic and fascinating, but they can also be disorienting and frightening. And these are spaces that, as a society, we have learned to resist, avoid, and ignore. In our society, the feminine has lost her lineage, her ancient mystery traditions, her ancient rites and rituals, and in the absence of her guides and her frameworks, she meets us in the world of the unconscious and in the world of altered states of consciousness. Through dreams, meditation, active imagination, holotropic breathwork, anthrogenic journey, she offers her transformative energies to us. The unconscious is where the feminine work goes on undisturbed. Here, she restores the links between our matter and our soul, and she supports the expansion of our consciousness. However, again, in our Western culture, we don't know how to understand and decipher the symbolic and archaic language of dreams and imaginations that she's able to reach us through. In our culture, we recognize language, which is a masculine principle. Language is the rational and ordered container of experience. The worlds beyond that space, beyond to the feminine. And here is where we meet what is beyond words or beyond immediate perception. In the Garden of Eden, Eve took a bite from the apple from the sacred tree of knowledge. This was a mythos that suppressed both the feminine and expanded awareness into sin within our consciousness and merged both of them with the shadow side. This was the point where humanity fell into duality. Up until that point, the badness was somewhere out there, it was carried by a snake, but from that point onwards, humanity got wrapped in it. The paradox had no solution. We were either in the garden or out of it. Mythologically and symbolically, this was the onset point of our ego development for our species. To leave the garden was to become aware, and that is self-aware. To remain in the garden would have been to remain in the unconscious Eden. In our predominantly ego-driven reality, we still keep femtheogenic consciousness in exile. We systematically maintain its inferiority, and we have remained very suspicious of its depth and potential. We have not been able to assimilate their energies into our human culture. We have distorted both into a diabolical form, and we have seen them as very seductive and very dangerous forces. The primordial temptress and the evil snake were separated from our conscious, from what they and the apple really stood for, which was the potential for transformation and expansion of consciousness. Patriarchy has suppressed femtheogenic consciousness. Patriarchy is a paranoid state of consciousness that tries to suppress anything that holds any potential for power or anything that threatens its structures. And it thrives on maintaining inequalities, and it thrives on maintaining unjust power relations. Patriarchy has actively waged the war against the feminine and psychedelics. But we have to be very clear that patriarchy today is not just synonymous with masculinity. Patriarchy today is a collective wound and a collective responsibility. Patriarchy's attack on the feminine is a collective responsibility. The devaluing of the feminine has damaged men and women because we all hold part of that archetype within ourselves. So when it gets attacked and when it gets distorted, it affects all of us. It doesn't matter what gender we are. And we're also all part of a culture that attacks nature and the feminine in all of us. We all have to retrieve her in all of us, for all of us. We all have to delve deep within ourselves and really question and recognize where we have played our own part in betraying her essence or in her oppression. Having lost our knowledge and connection to her ancient wisdom and her ancient essence, by the rational and scientific world we have created and we have surrounded ourselves with, we have really deprived ourselves from our connection with the unifying principle of creation. The patriarchy and its children do not know the feminine or the goddess. We have really misunderstood the power of her links to the very fabric of life and how essential this is for all of us and for our survival. Patriarchy has also been in conflict with psychedelics. Patriarchy cannot tolerate psychedelics, and psychedelics cannot tolerate patriarchy. Terence McKenna has written about the link between the ban on entheogens, the suppression on of the sacred feminine, and the rise of patriarchy. Patriarchy has traditionally favored substances that maintain boundaries, create a mindless state, and support the status quo. I'm mostly referring to caffeine, alcohol. Anthrogenic experiences, on the other hand, they deliver us to the land of ambiguity and the land of paradox. They cut through our cultural conditioning, and they give us a much wider lens through which we can examine what we call reality. They catalyze imagination, and they catalyze the expansion of our consciousness, but most importantly, they revive the archetypal feminine because of the links they have with her. They reawaken and filter her essence through to us, and they offer us her regenerative and her restorative capacities and energies. Anthrogenic experiences make the maintenance of rigid hierarchies unsustainable, and this is what poses a major threat to patriarchy. Patriarchy has done a very good job at countering that threat by making us believe that the use of these substances is an immoral or an antisocial act, which Peter referred to. And they have validated the criminal persecution of cognitive liberty, which is the freedom we all have to alter or enhance our consciousness. The main premise of my talk is that the feminine is psychedelic in a very deep sense. The archetypal feminine is psychedelic in a very deep sense. She shares entheogenic qualities that can heal, transform, and support the expansion of our consciousness. Now, the qualities that link the feminine with entheogenic states are also the main points of suppression for both, because these are areas that go against our Western mindset. They go against the grain. In setting out what the links are, we're also exploring what would be retrieved if these forces were allowed to be assimilated into humanity for our next stage of development, maturity, and growth on a collective level. So I will set out the areas where the two meet, and what really emerges is that once you bring feminine and psychedelics, you can't avoid nature. It's really part of the triangle. It's an essential part of the triangle, as you will recognize. So one of the major insights of femtheogenic consciousness is the awareness of our interconnectedness and oneness. Through our illusion of our separateness, we have eroded our links with Earth, we have eroded our links with each other, and we have eroded our links with our own deepest sense of self. And we have created a crisis that is environmental, it's social, and it's spiritual. But the feminine consciousness that emerges through the womb, where life regenerates from, the feminine consciousness that comes through the sacred centers of creation, where all life has emerged and regenerated from, is by nature aware that everything is connected. This is an embodied wisdom that is very clear. Similarly, in the infinite realms of an entheogenic experience, we're being shown to the threads that connect us to each other and to the rest of humanity, to the wider cosmos. So femtheogenic consciousness opens us up to the threads that weave us into oneness, in a spiritual but also in a very pragmatic way, in a cause and effect way. You know, whatever we do has an action and a reaction in the world around us. The next femtogenic consciousness link is boundary dissolving experience. So as I said earlier, our societies are based on divisive boundaries that maintain the illusion of separateness. And the ultimate and the most dreaded boundary to cross is the dissolution of the ego. The ego is a very important function for who we are. What is dysfunctional is our need to hold on to it, because the ego needs to go through a series of deaths and rebirths if we are to peel through the layers and get through to the deepest core of who we really are. Feminine consciousness is based on the elementary experience of boundary dissolution, which is motherhood, where the other is contained within oneself. And that is a symbiotic bond that, when things go well, extends way beyond the birthing process. So dissolution of boundaries is an elemental feminine experience on an archetypal level. Again, we're not thinking about these things just in concrete form. Psychedelic experiences are also based on the dissolution of boundaries on various levels. These experiences dissolve the divisive lines between us and other, past, present and future, masculine and feminine. Both the archetypal feminine and anthrogenic journeys deliver us to a point where, in order to evolve, we need to transcend our own boundaries and release ourselves from our delicate sense of reality. The next anthrogenic link relates to chaos. So we have battled for centuries to manage and battle chaos because we have considered it to be one of our greatest survival threats. We relate to chaos as a state of disintegration rather than a stage of transformation. We have failed to acknowledge the inherent order it contains, because its order is not to be imposed, it is to emerge. Its order is creative in nature. In its field resides the deeper wisdom of the creative process. As we saw earlier, the archetypal feminine in the dynamic aspect has forged a very close link with the regenerative aspects of chaos, and with its capacity to support new forms and evolution. Anthrogenic journeys embrace chaos and teach us that it's a very valued stage in our unfolding process of becoming. During a deep anthrogenic journey, we go through a rhythmic process where the self is taken apart and then put back together. Chaos gives place to order that is of greater complexity than before. So it's a step further in our evolutionary journey. A big part of what has driven our connection with nature, the feminine, and psychedelic states underground, or a big part of what has eroded our connection with these three, is our collective difficulty to be with chaos. And femtogenic consciousness can revive that relationship in a very meaningful way. The next femtogenic link relates to the vital cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Now, for our ancestors, they witnessed in nature that death is not an end in itself. Death is a stage of regeneration. Today, we relate to death with dread, and we're unable to really relate and connect to its true vital essence. And we are all immersed in a denial of it. The goddess Kali is a powerful feminine archetypal symbol of that journey. She teaches us that the goddess that gives life is the goddess that takes life. Creation gives place to destruction. Destruction that's in service to life gives place to creation again. Kali is a goddess that's in constant movement. She creates to destroy and destroys to create, and she is indifferent to our ego's demands for survival. For her, everything is one. We can only recover our deep inner treasures by meeting the dark side of the archetypal feminine, the devourer and the transformer. It's the same in anthrogenic journeys. The experiences that people come back and report the most significant, groundbreaking and long-lasting impact from is when these experiences have unfolded into the experience of ego death, ego and rebirth. We need the rebirth, otherwise we're not able to assimilate. So femtogenic consciousness allows us to flee our ego, if only for a second, and receive a wisdom that necessitates and even welcomes death. Now, that's not to say that loss, transition, and grief are not very painful transition portals. They are. It's to also access a wisdom where every end is just a drop in a very vast ocean. It's going to work, yeah. So the next femtogenic link relates to time. We have learned time is a big symbol and construct in our society. We have learned to treat it as something very fixed and something very concrete. But the archetypal feminine rhythms of regeneration reveal timelessness. The archetypal goddess of birth contains a soul. They are the same. So the archetypal goddess of birth contains a soul that moves through various birth canals. She participates in a mystery that goes beyond time. It intersects time. Similarly, anthrogenic journeys within the space of just a few hours open us up to mysteries that defy logic, and they help us move through past, present, and future in the most extraordinary ways. So through femtogenic consciousness, we come to experience and witness a very different quality and essence of time. The next femtogenic link is creativity. Now, patriarchy has suppressed our creative forces by focusing on the logic and focusing on the mind. But femtogenic consciousness supports the creative dimension of our evolution. The feminine is the creative matrix of our species. That's where we have all been created from. And she's connected to the patterns that belong to creation. Anthrogenic journeys are also highly creative spaces. Through symbols, images, visions, they create metaphors that help us connect to what is beyond words or beyond immediate perception. But our societies have not acknowledged the creative potential of these spaces, and for me the creative potential is really linked with the healing potential. I think it's very hard really to separate the two. But we have only learned to relate them as very chaotic, destructive, and dangerous states. Femtogenic consciousness carries a very particular kind of knowing that in our society we have neglected and avoided. Femtogenic knowing is intuitive, it is non-linear, and it's informed by the creative source. It can reveal to us the invisible, and that's the invisible corners of our psyche. This is where the shadow exists. Here we come to learn the limitations of our human experience. Here is where the heart can learn to work on compassion, to work on forgiveness for ourselves and hopefully by reflection for others. Claiming our shadow and its darkness helps us really come back into our humanity. And it invokes the restorative inner forces of integration because it allows the deeper layers of self to come into contact with our consciousness and hopefully integrate and help us reach a place where we're fuller. Messier, but fuller. Femtogenic consciousness opens us up to spontaneous, instinctual, and authentic ways of living. In humanity, in trying to shield ourselves from our impermanence and our lack of control, we have learned to perceive the world and reality as something concrete. And that concreteness has offered us some safety. But it has also led to staticness, staleness, and ultimately deadness, which is ironically the very thing we were trying to avoid in the first place. As we show in the form of the dynamic feminine, Feminine consciousness is really embracing change and embracing impermanence. She embraces a state of authentic being. She's not in a state of doing. She's in a state of surrendered, embodied being. The archetypal feminine in the dynamic aspect exists in a freedom that is full of potentials, is not bound by rules or order. Anthrogenic experiences too, they allow us to rebirth infinite times within the space of a few hours, and they shake away our social masks, they shake away our persona, they allow us to make contact with a truer sense of self. So anthrogenic consciousness, under its guidance, we can become something that's far wider and broader than what the stagnant social matrix will ever allow us to imagine. The final anthrogenic link is the unconscious. So in the symbolic world of Jungian analytic psychology, consciousness is connected with the masculine, the archetypal masculine, and the unconscious is the terrain of the archetypal feminine. And again, as we saw, it is the dynamic feminine that is linked with the invisible symbolic spaces of our psyche. And she's communicating these spaces into her consciousness through dreams and imagination and altered states of consciousness. Anthrogenic journeys raise unconscious material into consciousness, and they help us to get a glimpse of what exists below the surface of our undercurrent realms. Anthrogenic openings to these deep inner psychic spaces create the potential for our conscious and unconscious self to meet and hopefully integrate. And that really paves the way for our psychological journey towards wholeness. For our ancestors, nature was the great mother. She was powerful and vital in her threading of life and death. And that was the earliest collective blueprint we had on the image of God. As the sun god replaced the earth goddess, we lost our connection with nature. And we lost our connection with the most profound source of life and wisdom. Nature. That divine source of creation, the world of the soul, was once known as Anima Mundi. Anima Mundi held the knowledge that there's consciousness within matter. So Anima Mundi held the knowledge that the world is alive and that it's alive and in relationship. So our ancestors used to relate to Anima Mundi, the world of the soul, and they used to invoke Anima Mundi, and they used sacred ritual to activate the light of the world soul. Ritual was a way they used to commune with the forces of nature, to appease the gods and goddesses of abundance, of disaster, and to invite the gods and goddesses of abundance. And through ritual, they maintain a very complex emotional connection with the wider forces of life at large. And these early rituals and this connection with the world soul are part of our ancient brain. They're still there somewhere stored in the depths of who we are and where we come from. But it's a lineage that's forgotten largely in our Western world. Not around the world, but in the Western world, these links have been eroded. Through ritual, we bring ourselves back into belonging with the wider whole, and we reanimate the forces of the world around us. In the West, we have lost the mythological, the symbolic, and the religious frameworks. And in the worlds of Joseph Campbell, we have rationalized all gods and devils out of existence. So we have displaced, really, our spiritual capacity from its rightful expressions. Today, we understand Anima Mundi only as a concept, because we don't live a life that's aligned to its principles. We have forgotten how to live a life that relates to the light within nature and relates to the light within us, and we have forgotten that the world is alive. As a result, we have disconnected from our intuitive capacity, our imagination, and we've lost touch with the magic stuff of life. Meditations, mantras, active imagination, Anthrogenic journeys, they all remind us, they're all tools for activating that dormant capacity we have. And they all return us to the magical side of the human experience. They take us to an embodied wisdom that, again, we have forgotten, and they can transform our ego consciousness into a soul consciousness. A connection with the anima mundi, a connection with the world soul, can bring us back into connection with our own soul. The masculine and the feminine are the fundamental archetypal energies and principles of life that make up the entire universe. We're being called to create new mythologies and new frameworks that integrate. We need to integrate the lunar feminine wisdom with the solar masculine consciousness. A healthy future will only be balanced by the divine androgen. We are beyond the point where evolution for our species is a matter of physicality. This is not what we need at the moment. Evolution for our species at this point is a matter of interiority. We really need to go within and discover who we really are, away from the social constructs and our social personas. To peel through the layers might require a series of deaths and rebirths. We might have to die to our jobs, we may have to die to our relationships, we may have to die to friendships, to faiths, and anything that no longer serves the true essence of our deepest self. Every one of these deaths is a sacred initiation towards the emergence of a truer self. Because to enter the core is to awaken the light that resides within the core of every living thing. So to enter the core is to activate the anima mundi. The revival of femtogenic consciousness can support the emergence of a planetary consciousness, because as many people have said before me, our crisis is a crisis of consciousness. The world soul is suffering and we are suffering too, and we need to always remember the world's wounds and imbalances are a reflection of our own collective wounds and imbalances. Our times really call for outer activism to be matched by inner activism. We have to delve within as well as act on the outside. In the femtogenic channels of interconnectedness, of oneness and of singularity, we learn that changes are like ripples. And to work on the whole is to work on the one, and to work on the one is to work on the whole. Thank you very much.